Today I'm sewing and sharing New Look H0171. This pattern would serve you as a great swimsuit cover-up or a kimono-style tunic. I had a little more fun than usual planning for this sewing project. I signed up at mybodymodel.com and I downloaded a personalized croquis so I could plan out the specific pattern view and fabric choices before I committed to cutting out my fabric. When you sign up on their website, you enter in all your specific body measurements, getting down to specifics like your neck and thigh circumference, your shoulder width, and your waist to hip measurements. It filters all that information and produces a croquis that looks just like you. This helps you better visualize your projects and plan for successful sewing. But for this pattern, you can find it at your local fabric store and online. I've left a link for you below so you can check out all the details, grab a copy, and sew it along with me. So grab that pattern, cut out your fabric, mark your dots and notches, and let's get started. Place your back bodice pieces right sides together along the center back, matching your triple notches, and pin in place. Sew your center back seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and serge your seams to finish. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of one back neckband and one set of front neckbands. Place your front and back neckbands right sides together at the shoulders, matching your notches, and pin in place. Sew your shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. Now open out your back bodice along the seam that we just sewed and place your front and back pieces together along the shoulder seams, matching your notches, and pin together your shoulder seams. Sew your shoulder seams on both sides with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and serge your seams to finish. So here are my front and back bodices opened out. I'm going to take my facing pieces and start applying it to the neckline of the bodice. I'm going to match up the outer edge of my facing with this outer edge of my neckline, matching my center backs and shoulder seam, and pin in place all the way around. As you're pinning around the back neckband, it may feel like there's more material to the neckband than there is to the neckline. So you can take a pair of scissors and snip into your back neckline of your bodice within your seam allowance and not beyond. Just making a few short clips to this bodice neckline so that you could ease it into the back facing. And do this on both sides of the back neckband. And then take this to your sewing machine and sew all around the neckline with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And now that my facing is sewn to my bodice, I'm going to trim my seams by about half using my pinking shears. Now take this to your ironing board and press your facing over that seam so that your seam allowance is pressed toward your facing. And press that all the way around. At the bottom of your front neckband pattern piece, you have a dot indicating where we're going to be sewing the two edges of the front neckband together. And I've transferred these dots to the two bottom edges of my front neckband pieces. Place the bottoms of my neckband right sides together and pin in place. So from the dot, backstitching at the dot to the bottom of the garment. Take your uninterfaced facing pieces and place them right sides together at the shoulder seam. Again, matching your notches and pin in place. Sew at the shoulder seams just as we did for the other pair with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. Now we want to finish the entire outer edge of this inner facing piece. The pattern instructions give us a couple options here. You could simply take it to your serger and serge the entire outer edge and have it finished that way. You could also do a tiny rolled hem, or you could simply take this to your ironing board and fold the edges to the inside by 1/4 inch and then just stitch that in place all the way around. I'm going to be using my serger to finish these outer edges. And just as we did for the two front edges of our interfaced facing pieces, we're going to place our two front edges right sides together, and in place. We're going to start our sewing at the dot, backstitching to secure, and then sewing to the bottom of the facing, just as we did earlier. Now place your neckbands right sides together, and we're going to pin together from the large dots at the bottom of the garment all the way around this inner hole. Make sure to match up your shoulder seams and your center backs. We're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew all the way around with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. As you start and stop your stitching at this bottom large dot, I'm going to move the joining seam allowances out of the way so that I can cleanly place my needle at the dot to start my stitching. And I'm going to sew all the way around, and when I get back to the large dot on the other side, I'm going to move this material out of the way so that again I can cleanly access that dot on the other side, back stitching to secure. Now that we have the two neckbands sewn together, we're going to understitch. Turn your uninterfaced neckband piece over the seam, and we're going to sew this facing to the seam allowance about 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line, all the way around. And then you can turn this facing to the inside and give this neckline seam a really good press all the way around. Now that we've pressed this facing along the seam line and to the inside of the garment, we're going to place the serged edge of this inner facing over the connecting seam allowance, which should still be pressed to the facing side. Once you have that laying over that seam, pin it in place all the way around. Now we're going to sew our inner neckband all the way around. I'm going to be stitching in the ditch from the right side of the fabric. I'm going to place my needle right into this seam and stitch all the way around, periodically checking underneath to make sure that I am catching this facing on the inside. Now with your front and back bodice pieces right sides together, pin your underarm seam. Do this for both underarm seams and sew them with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and serge your seams to finish. The hem for the bottom of each sleeve is 3/4 of an inch. I've gone ahead and taken both sides of the sleeve to the ironing board and pressed up that hem to the inside by 3/4 of an inch. We're going to create a rolled hem here. We're going to take that raw edge and fold it to the crease, and then fold that material on the crease and edge stitch close to this inner fold all the way around. And we're going to do this for the bottoms of both sleeves. At the very top of our front skirt pattern piece, we have marks indicating where we're going to be sewing our buttonholes. I've cut a few scrap pieces of interfacing to apply to the fabric over those buttonhole markings. I've fused the interfacing to the wrong side of the top of my front skirt piece. If you're working with material that's very thin, you may want to add a few layers of interfacing so that you're sure your material will be stable enough to handle those buttonholes on your machine. Now I'm going to take this to my machine and sew my two buttonholes. And then open up both buttonholes. Place your front and back pieces right sides together, matching your side seams, and pin in place. And do this for both side seams. Sew both skirt side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and serge your seams to finish. Now with my bodice right side out, I'm going to place the bodice inside the skirt pieces, which are wrong side out. And I'm going to pin them together all along the waistline seam, matching my center front, center back, and my side seams. Now that I have that waistline seam pinned all the way around, I'm going to sew it in place with a 3/4 inch seam allowance. Now that we've sewn that waistline seam, we're going to trim the seam allowance for the skirt piece only. And we're going to trim it so that it's about 1/4 of an inch wide. Now that I have my skirt seam allowance trimmed all the way around, I want to take the opposite seam allowance to the ironing board and press it to the inside by 1/4 of an inch all the way around. Now that I have that top seam allowance pressed by 1/4 of an inch, I'm going to pull the bodice out from between the skirt pieces. And I'm going to take this seam allowance that's pressed under and fold it down over the opposite seam allowance. And we're going to edge stitch close to that folded edge all the way around, and this will form our casing. I've taken both of my drawstrings to the ironing board and I've pressed them both in half lengthwise. And now we're going to take them to the sewing machine and sew 1/4 inch away from the folded edge all the way from one end to the other, and do this for both drawstrings. Using a needle and thread, I've tied the thread firmly to the seam allowance at the short end of my drawstring. Now I'm going to take the needle and insert it through the open end and slowly draw it through, turning the drawstring right side out. Now I have both of my drawstrings turned right side out, and I've cut a piece of 1/4 inch wide elastic according to the size guide listed in the pattern instructions. Now I'm going to take the short edge of each of the drawstring pieces and line them up with the short edges of my elastic and pin in place. And now with one short edge of the drawstrings attached to either end of the piece of elastic, I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and sew the drawstring to the elastic on both sides with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, zigzag stitching a couple times back and forth to secure. For the opposite raw ends of my drawstring, I'm going to fold them over about 1/4 inch each time. And then using a needle and thread, I'm just going to slip stitch closed. And I'm going to do this for both raw ends of my drawstring. Now with a small safety pin attached to one end of my drawstring, I'm going to lace it through the casing at my waistline, through one buttonhole and out the other. To secure the drawstring within the casing and to maintain the elasticity in the back of the garment, feel with your fingers on the inside where the drawstring meets the elastic. And with that end of the elastic lined up with that side seam, stitch over that casing along that seam line back and forth a few times to secure. And secure that elastic at both side seams. The very last step is to hem the very bottom of the dress. I've taken the bottom of the dress to the ironing board, and I've pressed up that hem to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch. Now we're going to do a rolled hem just as we did for the ends of the sleeves. So fold that raw edge to the crease, and then on the crease, and edge stitch close to that inner fold all the way around, and then you're all done with your dress. Thank you so much for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out my other videos for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.